Okay, so in cycle 5, we talked about photosynthesis and how plants make sugar for energy. And today we're going to start looking at the process of cellular respiration, which is how you break down food into sugars and how that moves into our cells and gets made into a usable form of energy called ATP. So, first, let's review here. Photosynthesis, if we take a look at that equation, we had carbon dioxide coming in from the air and some water. And then we added some sun to that. And we got glucose, which is that sugar the plant makes, and oxygen. Okay? So this was photosynthesis. And this is happening in the chloroplast. Now, you guys, because you can't just sit out in the sun and drink water and take in air to make your food, you actually need to go and consume it because you are a consumer. So you are going to say, let's go to the drive-thru this morning. We're going to drive through McDonald's and eat a sausage egg McMuffin, hash brown, and an orange juice. Okay? Well, that can't just be delivered to your cells like that. So first you're going to chew it, and then it's going to go into your stomach, and you're going to digest it. And if I can just generalize this process, your body is going to break it down into a simple form to move into the cell, and that's called glucose. Not that easy, but for today it will be. And you are taking in oxygen, and it's being delivered to all of your cells. And out of that, we get, so what are our products that we give off? Well, CO2 gets taken out, and you would exhale that. Water, which you eventually pee out, and then we get energy. Okay, so there's some energy made, and this is in the form of ATP. This is happening, or I should say, this is called cellular respiration. And this is happening in the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. So over here we have the process, photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And over on the right, we have the organelle that it's happening in, the chloroplast in a plant and the mitochondria in you or animals or other things that are doing cellular respiration. Now, don't get me wrong, plants also have mitochondria and they are also doing cellular respiration, but the plants are able, because they're a producer, to make their own sugar. Now, what do you notice between these two equations? Take a look here. In photosynthesis, if these two things are formed, these are the products. Well, look at cellular respiration. Those are the reactants. So what comes out in photosynthesis is actually what goes in on cellular respiration. Coincidence? I think not. So let's take a look at cellular respiration a little bit closer. If I can move my screen. Okay, so cellular respiration is going to start with glycolysis. And this is happening out in the cytoplasm. So we are out in the fluid part of the cell. And this one we call anaerobic. Okay, which brings me to a side step here. We have aerobic and anaerobic. Those are forgot the O. Okay, aerobic means that it's going to need oxygen or has to happen in the presence of oxygen. If you're anaerobic, that means that oxygen does not need to be there. So for glycolysis to happen, it's anaerobic. It doesn't need oxygen to be present. And really what's happening in glycolysis is we're going from glucose, okay, so we're taking that C6H12O6 and we are going to change it into 2 pyruvates. And if you look at the word glycolysis, okay, lysis means to split. Glyco is probably some root Latin something word for glucose. So glucose we know is C6. So there's 6 carbons. And what we're going to do is we're going to lyse it and split it, and we're going to make 2 pyruvates. So rather than you thinking I'm speaking Greek here, really all it is a 3 carbon and a 3 carbon. Okay? Now we're going to move into the mitochondria. So this is happening out in the cytoplasm, and at the end of glycolysis, we have a net gain of 2 ATPs. Okay, remember that's the energy that's being formed. So we're going to form little bits as we go along here. The next part we refer to as the Krebs cycle. Don't put an apostrophe S. I found out the hard way. It can also be called the citric acid cycle because that's actually what it's making. And so now this is going to be happening in the mitochondria. And this one is aerobic, so it needs to happen in the presence of oxygen. If there's no oxygen present, Krebs cycle does not happen. And what are we going to produce here? After this, we're going to get 2 more ATP. Okay, so we've got 2 more to the good for the 1 glucose that was put in. And you're also going to produce that CO2. Okay, so those are not necessarily the waste products, but it's what's being produced. Sorry, I totally just slurped my coffee as I'm recording. Okay, the next part and the final step is what we call the electron transport chain. Okay, and I'm going to abbreviate this ETC. Here, this is where all of the ATP really gets made. This is happening again in the mitochondria. This is also aerobic, so we've got oxygen going in here. And on this one, you're going to make 34 ATPs. So it's pretty efficient if there's oxygen present. And this, you also make the water at this step. Now remember, this is a chain, the electron transport chain. So things keep bopping across and you're kicking out ATP on the bottom. So it's not like you go and just put that 1 glucose in, it's transferred in, and boom, you get 34. That would be quite a bit of energy being released. But now, after all of this is said and done, this is the final step. We have 2 plus 2 plus 34. When there's oxygen present, okay, cellular respiration with oxygen, you're going to get a total of 38 ATPs. Okay, so there's the big picture here. Quite efficient because in went only 1 glucose. Now, let's take a look at a flow chart. So we always start with glycolysis, and that is anaerobic, because you're going to see these questions. And at glycolysis, we lyse the glucose, and we end up with 2 pyruvates. Okay, now there's 2 ways we can go. If we have oxygen present, so we're positive for oxygen, this is called aerobic, and you're going to go through the Krebs cycle, and you're going to go through the electron transport chain, and you're going to kick out a total of 38 ATP. Now, the other side of this that we haven't really talked about yet is when there's no oxygen present. So if we don't have oxygen, we are going to go anaerobic, and we're not as efficient. This whole idea is called fermentation. And there's actually lots of good things that come out of fermentation. One that's kind of good and kind of bad, we're going to talk about both, is when we have fermentation and we produce lactic acid. Okay, so lactic acid can be produced in muscles. And this is what makes your muscles feel yucky. So if I tell you to go out and sprint for as long as you can, and when I'm talking sprinting, I'm talking give it your everything. Those muscle fibers are twitching as fast as they can. they're very quickly going to run out of oxygen. I teach biking classes in the morning, and I tell people to get up on their pedals and we are going to sprint. And those legs are pedaling as fast as they can, and those people start sucking air. And after a while, their legs are hitting the wall. Like they can't go fast anymore because they have lactic acid building up. So then I tell them to sit down and rest, and they pedal nice and slow, and they get their breath underneath them, and we start getting oxygen back to those muscles, and it flushes out that lactic acid that's building up. The other way that lactic acid could be kind of a good thing is if we have bacteria fermenting in an anaerobic environment. Lactic is also lactose. So when bacteria get the lactose sugar, which is found in dairy, that's responsible for producing yogurts, which gives, that lactic acid is what gives yogurt its little tang at the end, that tanginess that, now if you're eating stuff that comes in a tube with 5,000 grams of sugar, you might be missing that tang that's supposed to be there. The other way that this might be good is in cheese. Okay. Another form of fermentation that we talk about is alcohol. So alcohol fermentation, okay, actually is going to produce ethanol, which is the part that makes people drunk, or I should say, and CO2, which is the part that makes things bubbly and the gas that's given off. So here, if we take yeast, okay, and you put yeast in the presence of barley and hops and whatever else is in there, you may be producing some beer. Okay, let's leave some grapes with yeasts and no oxygen. You put fruit in a bowl, it's going to start fermenting and giving off a bunch of gas when you pop that lid. It doesn't even have to be wine, but you better be careful because there's also going to be some ethanol given off. So production of wine. And then probably my favorite, everybody's favorite, would be in bread. Okay, so you make that bread dough with flour and sugar and yeast, and that sugar is chomping down on that, the yeast is, because yeast is alive. So it's chomping down on that sugar, that's its food source, and when it's eating and going through metabolic reactions, it's giving off CO2, and that's what causes that bread to rise. Okay? Now, a couple of things we did here in class. We watched the 1997 Ironman, The Crawl, it's called, and it's two women doing the Ironman in Kona, and they have absolutely no fuel left in their systems, and so cellular respiration process is shutting down. Okay, they've got major issues. They're not getting oxygen enough. They have no fuel left to take out cellular respiration. Even the anaerobic, all this lactic acid has built up. They call it bonking. And these two women are both bonking at the end of the huge Ironman race. And then the other thing that we did in class is we did a lab looking at yeast. And we know yeast is mixed with sugar and flour and stuff, but Jim Baker, the bread man, is looking at how does the amount of sugar, or this in this case sucrose, which is your table sugar, the amount affect your bread. So if you give yeast more sugar, are they going to produce more CO2 and make that bread fluffier? The other thing we looked at in the lab was temperature. So how does temperature affect the activity of those yeast cells? Okay, because you've got all these enzymatic reactions taking place when you give yeast or give sugar to yeast, and it's going to produce CO2. So really, Jim Baker, the baker man, is looking to produce super fluffy bread, which means he wants lots of gas given off so that inside of that bread pan, that bread is going to rise up nice and fluffy. And then when you bake it, it stays there and you've got nice airy bread. Okay, that lab will also be put into